Welcome everyone to another edition of the Classic Comic Archive, a series where I recap and review many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is Tales to Astonish 45, cover dated July of 1963. The issue was written by Stan Lee and Ernie Hart, drawn by Jack Kirby, inked by Don Heck, and lettered by Art Simic. Our issue opens up with a striking splash panel, teasing Ant-Man and the Wasp's coming battle with Egghead and his evil anteater. But before we can witness such an epic showdown, we must first recap the origin of Ant-Man's most brilliant villain, as shown in Tales to Astonish 38. Before he was a supervillain, Egghead was just a normal scientist working for the US government. But then he was caught selling atomic secrets to foreign nations, and was thus fired, and blacklisted from the scientific community. Unable to find work elsewhere, Egghead agreed to help a group of gangsters defeat Ant-Man. Learning all that he could about ants, Egghead invented a machine that allowed him to speak with the insects. He then traveled to an anthill, and promised to free its inhabitants from Ant-Man's tyrannical rule. He was under the impression that Ant-Man treated his ants like slaves, when in reality, they were his friends and partners. Thus he allied himself with a group of ants that were still loyal to Ant-Man. Of course they then betrayed him, and his plan fell apart, but he was able to escape nonetheless. Yet now a wanted criminal, Egghead was forced to settle into the life of a flophouse bum. Months later, he's known among fellow vagrants as a wacky nutjob who constantly rambles about ants. Holding this view of him are two criminals, Ape and Twister. One night, they come into the flophouse talking about how hard it is to be a criminal, now that Ant-Man's got a partner in the Wasp. Overhearing their conversation, Egghead approaches the two criminals and offers to help them get revenge on Ant-Man. While Ape doesn't want to indulge the delusions of a crazy person, Twister agrees to hear him out. So Egghead tells them his story, and then asks them what they know about the Wasp. As he listens to their response, Egghead realizes that she's the key to defeating Ant-Man. So he proposes a sinister plan, in which they'll kidnap the Wasp, and then use her as bait to capture Ant-Man. Agreeing to the plan, Ape and Twister then use their criminal contacts to secure Egghead a secret laboratory. Some time later, Egghead emerges from hiding as renowned zoologist, Professor Carl Stryker. Of course this persona's completely made up, but nevertheless, Egghead's able to make himself the key speaker at a series of public lectures on entomology, the study of insects. These lectures prove popular with the public, and thus Egghead's eventually offered the opportunity to speak at the city zoo, and create an insect exhibit of his choice. So he chooses to make one about wasps, with the expectation that the wasp herself will show up. But to make sure she will, Egghead begins planning a heist to steal a priceless diamond necklace, and then use it as bait to lure her in. So, while disguised as Professor Stryker, he travels to a luxury diamond store, and takes mental note of its layout. He then returns to his secret laboratory, and manages to sketch a perfect copy of the store's blueprints. So later that night, he and his partners break into the store. They take out its guard with knockout gas, and then fry its alarms with a special gun that Egghead's invented. To prevent any watchful ants from telling Ant-Man what's going on, they activate another device that scrambles any messages coming from the ant's antennae. Thus while Ant-Man's crime alarm indeed goes off, he can't make sense of where it's coming from or what's going on. So he calls Janet and asks her to come over, as although he's not sure what's happening, he knows it must be serious, and thus wants her on standby. So Janet comes over, and the two then wait for an update on the crime. An hour later, they finally receive an unscrambled message. It tells them all they need to know, and thus they quickly head off for the diamond store. But by the time they get there, Egghead, his partners, and the priceless necklace are long gone. So Ant-Man and the Wasp leave without any clues, while Egghead is scheming his next move. Yet if Ape and Twister have anything to say about it, there won't be any next move. As far as they're concerned, they can just sell the priceless necklace and retire altogether. They don't need to bother with getting revenge on Ant-Man anymore. Of course Egghead, who's obsessed with defeating the hero, disagrees, and convinces them that if they don't destroy him, he'll never stop coming after them. So they acquiesce, and for the rest of the night, help Egghead set up his exhibit at the zoo. The next day, Egghead delivers the first of his lectures to a packed crowd. And as he'd predicted, Janet's in attendance. Once he's done with his lecture, he lets her and the rest of the audience explore his exhibit, the main attraction of which is a large replica of a wasp's nest. Peering into the nest, Janet spots the stolen necklace hidden inside. At first she considers telling the police, and then Hank, but ultimately decides that she'll recover the necklace and apprehend the thieves by herself. She thinks that Hank sees her as nothing more than a scatterbrained child. Yet by solving this crime by herself, she thinks she can prove to him that she's a fully fledged woman and a potential lover. So later that night, she changes into the Wasp and heads back to the zoo without telling Hank. When she gets there, she flies right into the Wasp nest, not realizing that Egghead and his partners are hiding in the shadows. Thus, as she's walking through a miniature maze, they trap her inside and begin preparing for Ant-Man's inevitable arrival. Yet when he gets there after receiving her distress call, he makes the same mistake and crawls right into the nest. But this time Egghead pulls a special switch and drops Ant-Man into a tank with an iguana. He then gives him a miniature lance and tells him to battle the lizard like a medieval knight fighting a dragon. In place of a steed, Ant-Man mounts an ant that had fallen in with him and then charges at the iguana. Despite the massive size difference, he's able to dodge the lizard's lashing tongue and then puncture it in a vulnerable spot. Apparently this defeats the iguana, as Egghead announces that it was only the first of many battles that Ant-Man must endure. Yet it doesn't seem that the hero's in the mood, as he then activates electronic springs within his boots and leaps his way out of the glass tank. In a panic, Egghead turns around and begins opening up a large crate. In the meantime, the Wasp reunites with Ant-Man, as she'd found the hole that he'd been dropped into. But then, out of the crate comes an anteater, and as it begins licking around the room, Egghead reveals that Ant-Man and his allies are doomed, as he's strung up the entire floor with small wires and is about to electrocute them all. So thinking quickly, Ant-Man pulls out a tiny lasso, loops it around the anteater's snout, and then uses his full-size strength to hurl the animal at Egghead and his partners, who are bunched up in the same spot. As they're recovering from the blow, the Wasp flips a switch and cuts the electric current running to the wires. As a last resort, Egghead and his partners pull out water guns filled with liquid gas. But before they get the chance to fire, the Wasp grabs Ant-Man's lance, which is actually just a pin, and pricks all of their hands. Thus they drop their guns, and Ape even stumbles backwards into a terrarium full of snakes. Yet in the commotion of it all, Egghead somehow manages to escape yet again. So while Ant-Man and the Wasp return the stolen necklace and take Ape and Twister to the police, their greatest enemy is free to plot his next move. And there most certainly will be a next move, as the issue ends with a shot of Egghead, having retreated to another secret hideout, swearing to strike again and get his revenge on Ant-Man. That concludes the Ant-Man story in Tales to Astonish 45, and another episode of the Classic Comic Archive. But as always, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought that this was a fairly solid story, and an improvement over Egghead's first appearance in issue 38 of this series. Being 3 pages longer than that issue, this one had more time to give Egghead a complex and exciting evil scheme. In his last appearance, his plan was to simply trap Ant-Man in a box lined with flypaper. It was rather pathetic. But in this one, he fooled everyone into thinking he was a renowned zoologist, he stole a diamond necklace, he came up with a bunch of inventions, and he pitted Ant-Man against an iguana and an anteater. Thus, as much as it utterly failed, I can't help but commend him for at least being creative. But in any case, let me know what you thought of this issue and the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching.